Hello and welcome to this video. This video is going to be called My 10 Favourite Live Jazz Fusion Albums. I was going to call it the 10 Greatest Jazz Fusion Albums, but all I'm going to get is a ton of comments saying, you know, you can't say anything objective about this, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think you can. I think what you can do is you can be a mixture of objective and subjective, you know. But I've decided to call this my favourites, and there's a couple of reasons for that, because I've got a few strange choices which I will justify as we go, and one of them is totally subjective, and it's only on the list because it's my opinion, and it's probably shouldn't be in the top 10 greatest jazz fusion albums, but it is in mine. So shall we kick off? I will kick off, right. Well, before I kick off, I just want to say a couple of things about jazz fusion. Jazz fusion is about people playing, and it's about people stretching out and soloing. You would think that the great albums in the jazz fusion genre would be live albums. It seems quite obvious that that's the case. When you start to actually go through them, though, there's not as many as you would think. This is quite hard to come up with a list. I haven't ventured into the 80s or 90s. This is really the classic jazz rock fusion. You know what this channel's about, you know. And I'm at the reason for that because I want a deal. I may do a modern live jazz fusion album list at some point. I want to separate it, but I just want to look at the classic period. I did consider some albums from the 80s and a few from the 90s, but I didn't feel that they had the same sort of majestic power of some of the albums on this list. That there is one from the 80s. Anyway, I'm going to kick off because I'm talking about it and I'm not doing the list, am I? So just kick off. Are you ready? Are you ready? I'm going to kick off. Right, let's got it over here. So, what have I got at number 10? Well, at number 10, I've got an album which I don't think is really a jazz fusion album. See, straight away I'm going to upset everybody. At number 10, I have one of the biggest selling albums in jazz history. This album has sold about 8 million copies. It's loved by so many different musicians all over the world. And I think even though it's not a jazz fusion album as such, I'm going to include it on this list, because if I don't, I won't be able to include it on any other list. So at number 10, I have Friday Night in San Francisco by John McLaughlin, Al Di Meola and Paco de Lucia. They captured something on this album. And it's a mixture of jaw-dropping virtuosity. I think it's a mixture of competitiveness, friendly competitiveness, but of also camaraderie. I think later on when this trio got back together, that sense of camaraderie was not there anymore. But I think on this album, you feel that they're enjoying what they do. And what we get is just 3 virtuoso guitarists that are all coming from different places. They've all got their own thing going on. I think obviously Paco de Lucia is coming in from a highly improvisatory flamenco background. John McLaughlin has got this sort of psychedelic, Coltrane-esque left field approach, very virtuoso. And Al Di Meola has actually he's somewhere between the two, with more of a flamenco influence, but I'd say more of a heavy metal influence. I'm pretty sure that the metalers that love this album, and there are many, they're buying into Al Di Meola. So when they solo, you don't feel like anyone else is treading on their toes. It's not like later on when Steve Morse joined, and I felt Steve Morse was just a sort of John McLaughlin copy, pretty much, and played like John McLaughlin. I didn't feel that there was that division. The trio had started off originally with Larry Coryell instead of Al Di Meola. I grew up with the Live at Royal Festival Hall video. That was the one that blew me away. And that's fantastic as well. And again, Larry Coryell's on that, even though he's playing acoustic guitar, he has a sort of an electric sound, and he's got more of a blues and bendy approach than McLaughlin. And I think that's what's really important. That's when it's worked, when you have 3 definitive personalities. And that's what we hear on this. And they just play. It's incredible. They've just released A Saturday Night in San Francisco. It's a completely different set of tunes that they're playing. And it's just as brilliant. People have said, oh, it's not quite in the same bracket. I can't hear it, to hear them doing Meet of the Spirits. I almost wish that track was on this one, because it's absolutely incredible. How the hell could these guys just get on stage and play a whole set of tracks of that complexity on a Friday night, and then just do a different set on a Saturday? We're dealing with absolute virtuosity. It's burning, it's exciting, it doesn't sound like what you would expect from an acoustic 3 guitars album. It's as fiery and as exciting as any fusion album, and it's on my list at number 10. It's only ranked down because it's not an out-and-out jazz fusion album. What have I got at number 9? Well, I have a John McLaughlin album. He's featured quite extensively on this list. I don't ever put 2 albums in by the same band, so I wouldn't ever put 2 Weather Report albums in this list or 2 Mavish Orchestra albums. But John McLaughlin, I've got away with having him on the Trio album, and I've got him here at number 9 with Live at Royal Festival Hall, which he made in 1989 at Royal Festival Hall. He played with Kai Eckhart and Try Like Gertu. I know this because I was there. And I think that when that album came out and he did that live gig, it wasn't just a return to form. He actually returned beyond what he'd done before in terms of his guitar playing. I think in terms of McLaughlin's guitar playing, he's at his peak with this trio. Right, I really do. I think in terms of conception and technically what he's doing, he's at an absolute peak of playing. This trio is groundbreaking. Try Like Gertu's approach to drumming is just revolutionary. Kai Eckhart is just the right bass player. Later on, he I think before that he'd had Jeff Berlin, and after that he'd had Dominic de Piazza, who was a very sort of almost like a sort of flamenco Django Reinhardt type of bass player, which sort of fits better. But Kai Eckhart's funky. He's funkier, and that's the thing that separates this album for me. This album could be a studio album, it'd be just as great. It doesn't matter the fact it's live. It's just after losing his way a little bit in the 1980s, which I think did happen to John McLaughlin. I think he didn't deal with the 80s well. The Translators album, some people think that's fantastic, and there's an aspect of that is, but he seems, there's a lightness that comes in the 1980s on those early albums, which if you're craving the Mahavishnu, you don't get. The 80s Mahavishnu project, what can I say? It sounds like McLaughlin under record company pressure to make a sort of album with that pushes the right commercial buttons at that time. He sort of lost his way. Anybody hungry for what he did with the Mahavishnu is not going to get it from any of the 80s albums. When he returns with this album in 1989, he's doing something else, and that has to be taken on its own grounds. And he's assimilated electric and acoustic. I think he's assimilated the Indian influences. He's assimilated the flamenco influences, the fusion influences, and all the stuff that he's explored up until that point. If you think about it, he's really condensed down on that album. And of course, it's live, so you hear them stretch out. Try Like Gertu's drum solo is absolutely incredible. Now, how much of this is the fact that I can remember the first time I ever saw John McLaughlin was at this concert, and sitting in the audience watching him do this stuff, it was just revelatory for me, being such a McLaughlin fan. I don't know. Anyway, but I put it on the list at number 9. So it's John McLaughlin live at Royal Festival. I'm going to move on now. So what have we got at number 8? It's only in recent times doing this channel that I've realised that John Lux Ponty's late 70s band is one of the great fusion bands of all time, and it ranks alongside the Mahavishnu, Weather Report, 11th House, and all those other ones. It's absolutely fantastic. They did a run of albums in the late 70s that are absolutely masterpieces, and whereas so many musicians in the late 70s in the fusion genre were sometimes making the wrong steps in their career, Ponty doesn't. Ponty pulls in a whole set of influences, and even when he goes towards the more commercial, his hooks are so strong that I always feel that this is really heavy, earthy, quality jazz fusion. And I think if you wanted just to go and hear some, straight down the line. Not like groundbreaking like the Mahavishnu Orchestra or Tony Williams' Lifetime. If you just want to hear this genre at its best, played incredibly, you're going to go for the 70s Jean-Luc Ponty albums. At that time, Jean-Luc Ponty did a live album called Jean-Luc Ponty Live, and it's a representation of that band live. They're an incredible band. They absolutely burn on that album. It features all the great tunes from all these other albums. It's impeccably recorded. It's a fantastic live album that represents one of the great jazz fusion bands of all time playing, and that's what we've got with Jean-Luc Ponty Live. So that's what I've got at number 8. There's not much more I can say about it. Go and check it out. It's fantastic, you know. So what do I have at number 7? Right, so when I put this list together, I thought Alan Holdsworth's got to be on the list. I saw Alan Holdsworth live a number of times, and that is possibly the greatest live experience I ever had, was watching Holdsworth, especially the second time I saw him, which was absolutely astonishing. There's not that many live Holdsworth albums, and we know why, because Alan Holdsworth was a famous perfectionist, and I think he liked the control of the studio. I think his perfectionism and the control given him by the studio, once we got digital technologies, was too much for him, and I think it hobbled his output. For years and years, there's no great Holdsworth album after 2000 and whatever. You know, he really just seems to have gone up his own bottom, as we say here in the UK, which is such a shame. Now he's dead. They're churning out live albums by him. How happy he would be by this, I do not know. Right? The quality control, where's that coming from? We're no longer hearing, you know, Holdsworth's artistic vision, are we? He did make 2 live albums, however. One was All Night Wrong, which I nearly put on the list. But the one that absolutely blows me away is the album Then! ! Right? That album is just scary. Holdsworth just burns on it. It sort of captures the Gary Husband band, whereas All Night Wrong is a little bit more ornate. It's just a trio. It's an incredible album as well, but I think for just face melting, you have to go with Then. It's also got a slight bootleggy feel to it, that album has. Why it came out, I don't know. I'm sure people will tell me, and they'll tell me the background of it. All I know is that Holdsworth live, he would often just go off the scale. And I think partly what he may have not liked about the live albums is when you have that sort of facility, it's very easy to just, you know, push it to the max, especially in a live gig where the energy's there. So I've often felt, for all his virtuosity, on studio albums, Holdsworth is very reserved. You never feel like he's overplaying. You feel like he's under control. It's not like that on this album. He just burns it down, right? And so I don't know. I've always felt, listening to this album, I've wondered how happy was Holdsworth with this coming out, because I don't think he liked it that much when he was just blurring notes out at 1 billion miles an hour. But for me, there are some musicians who can do that and it's absolutely boring. When Holdsworth does it, it feels like somebody surfing on the crest of the biggest wave that has ever existed. And that's what I feel you get on this album. I think it's essential listening for anybody who just wants to hear Holdsworth at his, you know, blistering peak, you know, just outplaying anyone else has ever lived. It's an incredible album. Right, so that's what I've got. Number 7 is Then. Number 6 I have, by Aldi Meola, Tour de Force Live. Right? This album is a little bit flawed, and the reason it's so high up on the list is because it's one of the first fusion albums I got. It's the first Aldi Meola album I got. It was the first time I ever heard classic tracks like Elegant Gypsy. It was on this live album and it absolutely blew me away. And it's really important, I think, because this could well be the last great jazz fusion album. I think there's an argument that Tour de Force Live, which is when's it from, 1981, 1982, it's the last of the authentic jazz rock albums, you know, which has got that, it's not been polluted by the funk. It's got that jazz rock sound as opposed to a fusion sound. It hasn't got it all the way through. There are some quite jaunty commercial tracks on there, and also it's a single album. I think if this had been a double album, this may well have made the top of the list. But there's some incredible moments on here, and the jaunty, you know, more commercial tracks, which are really come from Jan Hammer's involvement in this band. I'm such a sucker for Jan Hammer that when Jan Hammer gets very commercial, I kind of like it. You know, yeah, we want to hear some Burning Di Meola, but I kind of like it. I'm a sucker for it. So it's a very personal choice. This is. I've got it at number 6. This band with Steve Gadd, Anthony Jackson, that's the classic band. That's another classic fusion band. You know, Jan Hammer, Al Di Meola, Anthony Jackson, and what was it? Is it James Mingo Lewis on percussion and Steve Gadd? That's just a classic lineup. That's like the greatest fusion band you could ever put together. So that's what I've got anyway at number 6. Is Tour de Force Live by Al Di Meola. So what have I got at number 5? Well, recently I hooked up with one of my favourite drummers, one of the greatest drummers I think that's ever come out of the UK, Mark Mondesir, and we were talking about albums that sort of formed us, and I was telling him about mine, and he told me about his, and it's an album by Billy Cobham. It's a live album called Shabazz. I heard this very early on. You know, when I was a very young music fan, I was buying up Billy Cobham albums left, right and centre. When I got this one, I've got to admit, he was back then when I was sort of 14, 15 maybe, about 15 years old. It was a bit much for me. What do we have on Shabazz? Well, Billy Cobham's played drums in the greatest fusion band of all time, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. He's changed music history with that band. He then comes out with Spectrum, with Tommy Bolin on guitar. He changes fusion history again. And then he goes back to his roots and he forms a horn-driven band, which goes back to his time in Dreams. Now, Dreams was a band that he was in the late 60s, early 70s. And it's one of these early fusion bands, which includes Blood, Sweats and Tears, Chicago and Chase, which is like horn-driven jazz rock. And that's, some of this stuff's really incredible. And I think when he returns to that sound on Crosswinds and Total Eclipse and Funky Thide sings, he's breaking ground. And this is where bands like the Brecker Brothers, and if you go right up to Snarky Puppy, we can hear that sound that was advanced by these Cobham albums. At that time he made a live album, Shabazz, and what you get with this album is that horn-driven band with Randy Brecker, Michael Brecker, stretching out. Oh my God, did they stretch out? It's really out of the, you know, out and out, full out, just burning fusion. They're just playing outside themselves. It's all about being out. They're out in every possible way, or maybe not every possible way, but they're out anyway. They're like a horse comes out of the whatever the horse runs out of when it's in a race. It's like that. They're iconic. I've lost it with this album. I've lost it. I've just gone wrong. I can't even explain how fiery this is, you know. And Cobham's off the scale. It's just, I think it's what the fusion bands never did. This is what we should have had. Every fusion band, the 11th House, you know, Weather Report, what we needed was that album where they're just playing outside themselves. You know, I've just done a video about Deep Purple, and you got the Deep Purple studio albums where they play the songs and they take some solos, and you get Made in Japan and you get these great big extended jams where they're just going off the rails. We haven't got that many in the world of fusion. You know, we haven't got that. You know, some of these fusion bands aren't represented at all well live. You know, maybe that's because of the budgets. Maybe if you're a big classic rock band, you can afford to, you know, record gigs from every single tour and then cherry pick. You know, maybe with these lesser successful fusion bands, they had to grab live recordings when they can. And there's more to discuss with this. I'm going to move on and we might come back to this point. But yeah, Shabazz does it for me. we hear a different representation of this classic fusion band, and they are stretching out like nobody else. So anyway, let's move on to number 4. At number 4, I've got Live Evil by Miles Davis. Right, I've done a jazz fusion top 10 where I've put Miles Davis on, so that will keep everybody happy, and I won't have to have loads of comments with people telling me I don't know anything about jazz fusion because I didn't put Miles Davis on the list. You don't know anything, honestly, please. Right, if I do something like that, I've thought it out. There's a reason why I didn't put Miles Davis on my 10 greatest jazz fusion albums. There's a reason why I didn't put Frank Zappa on it, and it's not because they're not great. It's almost like they're too great, right? And when we deal with this genre, are these really fusion albums? Now, I would say, when it comes to Miles, that the Inner Silent Way is not a jazz fusion album. Bitches Brew is not a jazz fusion album. Jack Johnson's a fusion album, but Jack Johnson is flawed. Right, so it doesn't make my list. The greatest moments, which is the first 10 minutes of Write Off, is some of the greatest fusion ever recorded. But then there's other parts of the album where it's meandering, and it's and then side 2 is an interesting experiment, right? But is it really as great as In a Mountain Flame or Heavy Weather, you know, or Introducing the 11th House, which I think didn't make my list as well? Or Return to Forever. I don't think it is. I don't think the statement's as great. Innovatory, yes, they are. I think when he does Live Evil, what we get here is a burning live fusion album. What makes it fusion? Well, the electronics have really come in. Keith Jarrett's electric piano is distorted and wild. John McLaughlin's on this album and he's playing distorted electric guitar. Jack DeJohnette has really taken in what James Brown has done, what Sly and the Family Stone has done, is he's integrated that into his sort of Elvin Jones approach, and so he is just playing what I would call fusion drumming. Is there fusion drumming on Bitches Brew? I don't think there is. I mean, that's a completely different thing to me. But what I hear is a burning live fusion album. Does this make it one of the greatest fusion albums? I think it is amongst the great fusion albums, but I feel that this is one of the great live fusion albums, without a doubt, and I've got it here at number 4. Because I put this on the list, I couldn't put Agata on, and I couldn't put We Want Miles, and We Want Miles is a burning live album, so I've had to mention those. But this album also isn't 100% live. We've got some studio sessions that he did with Hermeto Pasquale, or how would you pronounce that guy's name, and the integration of that is interesting. Some people have said, when I read reviews about that this meanders. Can a live album really meander? What are we buying when we buy a live album? You know, we're buying a replication of the experience of seeing that band live. And what Miles Davis was doing here was he was extending the boundaries by getting his musicians to improvise into areas that hadn't existed before. The session that's equal to this, I think, is the Isle of Wight, you know, Call It Anything session. And I'm sure that's an album by now, maybe that should have been on here. But anyway, I'm basically giving a shout out to Miles Davis here and his 70s fusion stuff, which I think needs to be on the list. Right, so what have I got at number 3? At number 3, I have 8:30 by Weather Report. Okay, there are 2 or maybe 3 live recordings by the 70s Weather Report that we would have to consider here. One would be side 2 of their second album, which I've forgotten the name of at the moment. Oh, this is terrible. You do know I know this. This is incredible. Right, so I don't even know whether to stop now. I'm not going to stop. Right, so I'm going to look it up. This happens to me when I do these videos. And when I first did this channel, I can't even talk and write at the same time. I would stop and start again when this happened, and I don't do that anymore. I think like to capture what's going on live, like a live gig. This is what you're getting, you know. By the time I found this out, I'll bet you it will have popped into my head. I was only talking about it the other day. So on the second album by Weather Report, which of course is called I Sing the Body Electric. Wow, we got there in the end. Oh my God. I wish I'd never even gone down this route yet. There is some live stuff on side 2 and it's incredible. That stuff is taken from an album that was released much later. I think originally it was only released in Japan, and it's called Live in Tokyo, and that's an incredible live album. And all I wanted to say was that album nearly made the list on my list. That was nearly made the list. Right? But it didn't. Why did I put 8:30 on instead of Live in Tokyo, which is, you know, all this stuff that I've been talking about, you know, a band that does their studio thing and then you buy them live and they just stretch out and just blow your face off. That's what Live in Tokyo is like. The 8:30 though, I think is a great representation of a great band, which wasn't represented enough for me. This is one of the criticisms I have of the Jaco Pastorius era band. I think, especially the Peter Erskine lineup. This is supposedly the classic lineup by Weather Report, is the Peter Erskine Jaco Pastorius lineup. So we have Heavy Weather, one of the greatest fusion albums ever made, one of the most successful fusion albums ever made, sold millions, right, makes Jaco into a superstar, and then they come back with Mr. Gone, and I don't think Mr. Gone is one of their great albums at all. It's just badly conceived and doesn't sound finished off to me. Zawinul's got too much control, and there's some incredible Zawinul stuff, but it's not a bad album. It's a good album. It's not a great album. After that, we get Night Passage and the self-titled Weather Report. Night Passage is great, and that's the album that really represents this lineup. The self-titled Weather Report is just directionless to me as an album. But in there is this live album 8:30, which brilliantly represents that band at the top of their game, you know, as the biggest fusion band in the world at that time, touring around, playing live. They stretch out, they do some really interesting stuff on there. There's a Jaco Pastorius solo where he uses loops, and that's probably the first bass solo that has then gone on to sort of inform. There's a whole genre of like solo bass which people like Michael Manring and my great friend Steve Lawson has pursued, and that's in embryo on that album. We also get a side of studio stuff there, which is, I think, for that band, after Night Passage, is the strongest stuff they recorded in the studio. But the live stuff's absolutely incredible. The only thing I'll say about this is that little shuffle they did on Birdland. I wish they'd never have done that. But anyway, that's what I've got at number 3. I've ranked it really highly, and I do think it's one of the great live albums from the fusion thing. There was a later album called Live and Unreleased, I think, by Weather Report. That's burning, really is. But it's got Alex Acuna on drums. And Alex Acuna, that was the band for me, right? Peter Erskine's great, but Alex Acuna and Manolo Badrina, that was the rhythm section you wanted. It was incredible. Right, so what have I got at number 2? Right, this is an out-and-out burning classic. This is an album, right, and I've talked about this elsewhere on other videos. Sometimes you get live albums and you buy them because they're amazing live albums. Some albums are just great and they happen to be live, and you don't even notice they're live. This is one of those albums, and it is Heavy Metal Bebop by the Brecker Brothers. It's the best Brecker Brothers album. If you're only going to have one album by the Brecker Brothers, it's this one. And it opens up with East River, which is a studio track, and it's so catchy that it draws you in. And so it doesn't feel like you listen to a live album, and then we go into the live stuff. And the live stuff is just absolutely burning. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. 1, this is a live album and the band stretches out. And 2, they have Terry Bozzio on drums. And Terry Bozzio comes at this like a bull in a china shop. He just tears in. It's if there's any heavy metal on this album, it's Terry Bozzio that's providing the heavy metal, and he just explodes absolutely. And when Brecker and when Michael Brecker and Andy Brecker are taking solos, what you get is just Terry Bozzio just coming at him like Elvin Jones, but Elvin Jones shot through I don't know, Tommy Aldridge. It's like it's a way of drumming. It influenced me hugely, but it's a way of drumming heavy with double bass drums where you can still express yourself in a jazz way. And Terry Bozzio did, and of course people like Cobham and all these fusion drummers, they did that. But Terry Bozzio takes it further on this album. It's Bozzio's albums for me, but the solos are unbelievable. Brecker, Michael Brecker and Randy Brecker are both using a lot of effects, and I absolutely love it. And it's just a burning fusion album. I've got it at number 2. If you want to know what I think the greatest live fusion album is, it's this one. It's heavy metal bebop. What we've got at number 1 is something in its own category. So what have I got at number 1? At number 1, I have Between Nothingness and Eternity by the Mavish Nuksha. Now, what's this? I'll tell you what this is. Right, if you wanted me to describe it. This is the 3rd Mavish Nuksha album. The Mavish Nuksha album are the most important band in fusion, as far as I'm concerned. And doing this channel, even though I loved them so much, I've realised that that's the case. They're the defining fusion band. They're the ones who invented the genre. And they did 3 albums. In a Mountain Flame, right, which is the punk. It's the never mind the bollocks of jazz fusion, right? I think Schofield once said that his punk was in 1916 and at 280 BPM, and he meant the Mavish Nuksha, and I think that's the case with that first album. They take all the elements and they refine it and make it absolutely beautiful on the second album. But they're going around touring, and they are a formidable live band. They're taking these tunes that are on these first 2 albums and they're extending them, and you don't understand what the Mavish Nuksha is unless you've sat down with all those bootleg recordings and sat and listened to them, right? They try and make a 3rd album, it doesn't work. So they decide to do something which bands rarely do this. ELP did this as well with Pictures at an Exhibition. They decide to make an album and record it live, which is what we have here. And what we have is an album of new material, and these are the definitive versions of these tracks. Trilogy, Jan Hammer's Sister Andrea, and the sidelong Epic Dream. On this, you get 2 things. You get a new album with new material that no one's heard before, and you get it played by a band in a live setting that are also stretching out, right? The studio versions eventually did come out on the Lost Trident sessions. It's really incredible and very interesting to us Mavish Nuksha fans, but they're not as great as these live versions. The definitive versions of these tracks are the live versions. Cobham's sound drumming is off the charts on this, and the stretching out and it's in Dream is just Mavish Nuksha at their most intense. This is not only one of the greatest live fusion albums, it's one of the greatest fusion albums ever made. When I talk about Mavish Nuksha, there are many people coming on saying this is the greatest Mavish Orchestra album. The original mix for me was a little bit muddy, but that now has been fixed, and if you listen to the new mix, which you can get in the Mavish Nuksha box set on CD, it just sounds absolutely incredible. And with that you get another CD which is all it's another live CD recorded from this gig, and I think they were there for 2 nights, so I think there's a number of sessions they did. I might be wrong there, but and what you get are versions of tracks off the other 2 albums. I've got to be honest, listening to that stuff, it's great, but it's nowhere near some of the stuff you can get on bootleg. There's a number of bootlegs that I've got that are absolutely jaw-dropping, and they did record another live album that was held up, and I think it was recorded before Birds of Fire. It's an early recording, and I feel when I listen to the live bootlegs by the Mavish Nuksha, they're at their most burning and together when you hear them after the first album playing. Once they get to Birds of Fire, there's stresses on them, and as time goes on, rather than just playing together, their live concerts seem to become just solo showcases. So they start to play it, and then it goes into a long bass solo, and then they get up again, and then it all stops, and John McLaughlin does a solo, and I find that a little bit frustrating. I want to hear them burning, and you get that on the extra disc of the Between Nothingness and Eternity sessions, but it's fantastic to hear. But that doesn't happen on the proper album. On that album, they are playing together. The closest we get to a cadenza is the one that John McLaughlin does on 12-string electric guitar and Sister Andrea, and it's just mind-blowing. And what can I say? I'm right, aren't I? This is the greatest live fusion album of all time. I think this one, I've got it right. Between Nothing and Eternity by the Mavish Structure from 1973. So I've got to the end of my video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you want more, then go and watch a few more videos. And if you like it, then like and subscribe. And if you want to support me, there's a Patreon link down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video, which will be another roundup of my favourite live prog albums. Right, and you know what the proggers are like on here. They're going to have their suggestions, so stick around for that and have a look at the comments and see how much I got it wrong, which I'm sure I did. I say apologise now before I've even done it. I'm going to apologise for stuff I haven't done, but that's the way it is. Okay, see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.